This week, our chapter from Davies focuses on some different ways of dying. In particular, he considers what he calls death by social causes. So, unlike death from old age or natural causes, death by social causes, these bear different positive and negative social values. So, to list a few of the things he covers, military sacrifice, execution, genocide, suicide, and euthanasia. Really happy, uplifting topics, so sorry about that. Anyway, let's highlight a few of these here in the lecture. First of them being military sacrifice. So Davies talks about one study in particular, Blood Sacrifice and the Nation by Marvin and Ingalls. Within that, the authors interpret death of soldiers as a form of sacrifice that underlies and reinforces the United States way of life. They view it as this continuation of a tradition in Western civilization dating back to the human sacrifice that's depicted on the Parthenon in Athens. We know a lot of the buildings, construction, design in Washington, D.C. derives directly from Greek architecture. In this particular case, society is viewed as being held together through key ritual performances, central to which is warfare itself. Marvin and Ingalls go on to talk about the American flag as a totem, which means that it's seen as a symbol through which people corporately identify themselves and come to think of themselves in a distinctive way. So here in the States, we have a very strong sense of identity tied to the flag. We have a very strong sense of what that means to be an American and what it represents in terms of these types of sacrifices that have been made and unfortunately will continue to be made. What they note, though, is that the underlying truth is that the knowledge that society depends upon the death of its own members at the hands of the group. This is what we mean in terms of the types of sacrifices, sacrificial deaths that are associated with maintaining our society and with maintaining that sense of identity. Because of this, the military are viewed as a form of a sacred community, upholding and expressing the prime social values of what it means to be American. Marvin and Ingalls also talk about something called the cult of the flag. This is an expression of the system of sacrificial social bonding. Whenever we can imagine a military funeral taking place, the U.S. flag is draped over the coffin itself. That is then ritually folded, and this folding in their mind transforms the deceased person into a symbol that's then given back to their relative. Execution is another one of these social deaths. So as described by Davies, in exchange for the benefits of society, the protection that you need to be living amongst other people, individuals are expected to act according to a certain set of rules. To break those rules is to expect a degree of retribution. There were also, early on in societies, these sorts of concepts that it's my body and I can do with it what I like, but that only extends so far. This comes into the ideas of civil liberties. People are allowed to, act in certain ways and do what they want for the most part until they start impinging on the social, civil liberties of others. In this sense, execution is seen as the ultimate form of social control of a society over its individuals. And so this particular form then is reserved for the most serious crimes, which tend to be murder or treason against the society itself. What this means is that society is using death to demonstrate that society itself is of the greatest value. So for the greater good, one person acting out, causing issues for the community at large, well, something needs to be done about that person in order for the society, for the community to carry on. Nowadays, we see major differences between contemporary societies that derive mostly from our attitudes towards execution. The degree of social power that's expressed by the death penalty tends to match the extent to which a society exerts strong pressure over its members. Davies does a good job as well of summarizing Durkheim's study of suicide, which we talked about very early on in this class. Durkheim unfortunately suffered the loss of a friend very early on in his life, which is something that scholars think might have pushed him towards this interest in suicide itself. He unfortunately did experience some other tragedies later in life, including the loss of his son and his student Robert Hertz, who we've already been learning a bit about here in this class during World War I. So, unfortunately had a bit of motivation to be interested in this topic. So what Durkheim did is he studied his French society, the French culture within which he lived, and used a lot of statistical measures. He's credited with bringing in the sort of scientific perspective into sociology because of that. And through his work, he was able to identify these 4 types of suicide that we see listed here. So if you can think through these, you might be able to have a greater understanding of the spectrum across which suicide can occur, at least historically, and probably still does to this day. Suicide in general is often interpreted as a failure of an individual or of society. It's viewed as an expression of the hopelessness or of the triumph of negative forces over positive social forces. Because of this, many societies have traditionally buried suicides apart from other people. So there still are very many taboos associated with this form of death, and probably still will be for some time. One particular form of, suicide, they call it sacrificial death in the book, is SATI, or what's called concremation. And this takes place in India. It's not a very common occurrence, never really has been much even in history, but it's an important example to consider nonetheless. This is actually the joint cremation of a live widow on the funeral pyre of her dead husband. It's interpreted both as an act of devotion, but also as a pretty cruel act of violence against women. And this comes down to the motivation for the act, and if we can actually get at that and determine it. If it's voluntary, that's one thing. If there's coercion involved, well, then that tends to be seen more as this sort of cruel act against women. The practice itself derives from a funeral rite that was described in the sacred Hindu texts of a woman lying on the pyre with her husband before being summoned to leave and be united with his brother in marriage. This is interpreted in 2 different ways by traditionalists. They tend to differ on which part of the rite should be emphasized, if it should be the first part, where the woman is laying and remains lying on the pyre, sacrificing herself with her dead husband, or is it the second part in which she then leaves the pyre to join her brother-in-law essentially in marriage, allowing her husband's children to still be raised within the family essentially. Political rulers through time have campaigned against this practice. One study in particular Davies talks about is by Ashish Nandi, and this person identified 3 periods in Indian history when sati was more prevalent, and these periods actually tend to correlate with periods of political conquest and social change. Nandi also noticed that the practice is more commonly seen among upper castes or castes that sought upward mobility, as well as in more westernized or urban sectors of the population. The last one that Davies talks about and that I'll touch on here today is euthanasia, or what might be considered rational suicide at times. And this is what we mean by the logical capacity to ponder one's situation in life and, therefore weighing all considerations, decide on the option of death. Now, Davies talks about this as being a very clear example of an attempt at conquering death, and I have to agree. You're taking the power into your own hands, basically. In the medical world, it's coming around. It's making this more of a reality for people who desire this sort of option. The motivation behind this tends to sometimes be that most people aren't necessarily afraid of death itself, but the process of dying or the pain that they're going to suffer throughout an extended illness. They express the desire to want to retain their dignity and sense of identity. Obviously, though, with a topic like this, it's a legal debate. Do we as individuals have the right to choose when we die, how we die, and what sort of consequences does that leave for those who assist in the suicide itself? In this way, the rhetoric of death that Davies likes to talk about draws jointly on medicine as well as personal autonomy.